Good evening, everyone. How are you doing tonight? So let me know if you can hear me in the chat there. Do a little mic check as always, just to make sure that I'm going through. Okay, let me know if you can hear me in the chat. Okay, yeah, I'm getting word that I'm being heard here. All right. Well, welcome in, everyone. Glad to have you here tonight. Got a great show lined up for you. See who all we've got in the chat. We got a bunch of people here. John Sergei, thank you for coming in. Lemon Cake, Jeremy Croteau, Jason Lehman, Jennifer Bowman, Petite Aubergine, that's my daughter Jessica. Thanks for coming, dear. Who else we got? Sheila Loya. She says that she can't wait. She just found the 6 Degrees podcast through Strange Familiars and was super impressed. Love the way these girls think and work together. She stayed up all night listening. Susan Alexander Carbs. Anne Celine, Lady Anne from Caravan, Library of Lore. Thank you for coming. She's also my boss over at KPNL Radio. Josie Hawkins, Thumper, 1918. Okay, good deal. I'm going to go ahead and bring our guest in. And as I was mentioning there, she is from the 6 Degrees of John Keel podcast. If you don't know who John Keel is, you should. And we'll get into all that. But you make her mic hot here so y'all can hear. Folks, welcome Barbara Fisher to the Campfire Stream.
Hey, thank you. It's good to be here. And thank you, Sheila, for staying up all night and listening to us, although I hope you didn't have anything to do the next day.
And let's see who else we got coming in. DC Joy. Christine Adams. Hello from Columbus, Ohio. Well, hello back to you from Pacific Northwest here and just outside Portland, Oregon. And Barbara, you're in Ohio right now,
Yes,
correct?
I am. I'm in Athens, Ohio. So I'm not that far from Columbus.
Oh, okay. And Chris Jarvis, good to see you, buddy. Thanks for coming in. Another one of my mods there. Got some great mods here. Well, Barbara, go ahead and tell us a little bit about you and what you're about and about the podcast, and then we'll get into some stories.
All righty. Well, I was born and raised in West Virginia. I spent half my time in the capital city of Charleston, West Virginia, and then the other part of my time in my grandparents' farm. So I'm kind of a little bit country and a little bit rock and roll. Because, well, even the capital city of West Virginia is kind of rural anyway. But it's the closest thing we have to an urban area, so it's pretty cool. And I've been experiencing strange things pretty much all of my life that I can remember. And it runs in our family. There's people in my family on both sides who have had strange things happening. So I'm going to tell you some family stories, and I'll tell you some of my stories. And about my podcast, it's named after John Keel. He was a UFO investigator and paranormal investigator. You know, he started out as a travel reporter and as sort of a hard-nosed, news reporter. And he was assigned by, I think, Playboy magazine to do a story on UFOs back in like 1964, I want to say. And he started investigating, and he figured he'd be on it for a couple weeks, maybe a month. And it just got weirder and weirder the longer that he looked at it. And he ended up not even writing that article. They assigned it to somebody else eventually. And so he didn't even get to write the article, but he wrote a bunch of books. And he discovered that the more he looked into the paranormal experiences, the weirder his experiences became. If you ever want to learn more about John Keel, besides reading his books, you can also read Brent Rain's book, John Keel, The Man, the Myth, and the Enduring Mysteries, I think is the title of it. It's a really, really good book, and it gives a lot of insight into who John Keel was and what he was about. One of the things he said, and the reason that we named the podcast after him, was he said in his book, The Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings, or strange creatures from time and space, depending upon which edition of it you have. Mm-hmm. He said within 200 miles of wherever you live, someone has seen a hairy monster. Mm-hmm. And within that same area, somebody's seen a giant light in the sky, or a seemingly solid craft that's landed, or somebody has seen a ghost. And he said, you know, they may be your cousin, they may be your in-law, they may be your neighbor. You know, he said these things are the normal condition for the planet. And as I've gone along with my weird existence all these years, and the more people I've met and the more I've read, because I've been reading up on this stuff since I was about 10 years old, the more people that I've met, the more true what he said has become to me. It's fairly normal. And so the reason we started the podcast was because we wanted to reach out to people and kind of come out of the experiencer closet. That's what Keel called people like us who have lots of strange things happen to them, around them, in their families, whatever. And basically say to people, hey, you're not alone. This happens, and it doesn't mean you're crazy. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. Doesn't mean that you're, you know, not going to go to heaven when you die or whatever, you know, because people get really afraid of these things sometimes. And what it means is the world's stranger than we think it is. And so we kind of wanted to create a safe space for people to talk about these things and get them out into the open. Also, more people who talk about these experiences, that's more data points, and it kind of, once again, adds weight to, you know, the idea that our consciousness and our world is wider and more strange than it seems.
Mm-hmm. And Keel's books are just fascinating. I discovered them as a kid, a lot of the UFO books and things that he had written before he got into all that. And I actually met the man briefly back in the early 90s. I was friends with a gentleman named Ron Bonds, who had a book publishing company called Illuminate Press. And he was one of the ones that had reprinted Mothman mm-hmm. Prophecies before anybody was really familiar with it. And I was living in Knoxville, Tennessee one time, and I'd gotten an email from Ron, and he said, hey, Keel's going to be at my house this weekend. He lived in Avondale Estates, which is just outside Atlanta. He said, you want to have dinner with us? And I'm like, oh my God. Oh. So yeah, that was an absolute must. He was a fascinating man. Of course, he was much older then, and that was still about almost 20 years before he died, I think. But yeah. he was already in failing health and stuff. But just the volume of stuff, and like you said, he coined the term experiencer. And if you remember the old show from the 70s, Kolchak the Night Stalker, that was based on John Keel. And just amazing writer, and just very prolific. And I think he was an attractor, too. It's like anywhere he showed up, strange things tended to happen. Of course, I think he went there with that intention. And very much a part of the Mothman Prophecies and that whole thing that went down there in West Virginia. And I've got a picture of him up there on the screen. But now you said you've had a lot of personal, a lot of family experiences. Go ahead and share some of those with us, if you would.
Okay. Well, I'll start with some of the early stuff that was before me, that was passed down. And interestingly, the first ones I'm going to talk about happened in Mason, West Virginia, which is right down the road from Point Pleasant. Like right down the road, like not 20 minutes down the road, just like a few minutes down the road. I didn't know this, but the big farm that my grandparents always told me about that I didn't remember except in little flashes, I always thought it was just a bigger farm in Putnam County where they lived when I was growing up. It was actually in Mason County, and it was in Mason, West Virginia. And they had an incident. The first one was a strange disappearance of a dog. My grandfather didn't really like animals to live in the house. He was very much a farmer, and animals have purposes. You know, they don't just sit around. They have jobs. But the house had a problem with mice, and he really didn't like cats, But my grandmother got a smaller dog, and her name was Penny, and Penny would catch the mice. So she was allowed to stay in the house. And she was apparently a really sweet dog, really, really cute. And Grandpa, because she served a purpose, softened up on her and actually, liked her. And they went out one Saturday, all three kids and my grandma and my grandpa. I don't remember where Mom said that they went, but they went out and they came back at nightfall. And they had somebody who was helping milk the cows and stuff so they could stay out, all day. And they come home, and Grandpa went directly to the barn to, bring all the animals in and close it up. And Grandma and the kids went into the house, and they opened the door, which was locked. And all the windows were closed because it was supposed to rain. So they opened the door, and Penny doesn't come running. And that was weird, because usually when she heard the car come up the driveway, she'd start, barking and jumping and being excited. And they didn't hear anything. So they turn on the lights and they start yelling for her, and no Penny. And my grandma walked through and went into the kitchen and turned on the light, and there was a circle of bloody paw prints going in circles, like around and around, in the center of the floor. But only in the floor. There wasn't a puddle of blood. There wasn't any sign of a struggle. Nothing was knocked over, but just bloody paw prints in the center of the floor, and the dog was gone, and she never came back. The next day, when it was light out, they checked, around all the doors and all the windows outside to see if there were any paw prints in the mud, and there was nothing. And I remember, even my husband, who can be very stoic about things and somewhat skeptical, was like, no, that's creepy. That's totally horrifically creepy. Because there was no sign that anybody had broken in. There was no sign of doors or windows being unlocked or open. And there was no way for the dog to have gotten in or out. And so they still, my mom, the last time I talked to her a while back, still talked about that. So that was a really, really creepy thing. And it happened in the 1950s. So it was before the Mothman stuff, but it was in the same general vicinity of the Mothman issues that happened later in the 1960s, 1966 and 67. And then there was also, this is the same place, and it happened after Penny had disappeared. The family was gathered in the living room, and it was in the evening, and it was a summer night. So I don't know if you've ever been to West Virginia, but it can get really, really oppressively warm in the summer. Very humid, very hot. And they didn't have, they had an electrical generator. They didn't have like city electricity at that time. So they only had like one light on. And they had windows open with screens, and they had the front door open with the screen door open with it. And everybody was sitting there. Mom said that her brothers were reading, and she was reading. Grandma was crocheting, and Grandpa was reading the newspaper, and they were listening to the radio. And there was no thunder. There was no sign of lightning, but there was a weird buzzing sound and a ball of light that was, my mom described it as orangish and about the size, if you took a basketball and cut it in half and then made it into a ball, it'd be about that size. So it just came bouncing through the screen door, and it was sparking and sizzling and buzzing, and it sort of bobbed across the floor and into the center of the room, and it just sort of buzzed and bobbed and bounced around. And after, a little while, it just sort of buzzed its way out the window. The whole time while all of them are staring at it, and, my mom was screaming. She wasn't that old. Her brothers pretty much got up and ran for a shotgun, although what they were going to do with that, I'm not rightly sure. In later years when I heard her telling that story and my dad was there, he said it almost sounded like it was ball lightning, but there was no thunderstorm at the time. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does sound like ball lightning. That was what I thought. My grandmother told the story one time. Now, it was raining that time, but it wasn't a thunderstorm or anything, and they had the screen door open, and she'd been out sweeping the rain off the porch just because it made it easier to clean when it was wet, and a bouncing ball of, it was described as a whitish light, came into the house, bounced through the room, and hit the window, and then it made a very audible pop and was gone.
Yeah.
And now I've seen orange orbs like that, though I had an experience with one back in the 70s, about 73 or so. I had been to my brother's house, and on the way home there was a field I had to go by, and just at the edge of a tree line, it was almost like you described, it was smaller than a basketball, but it was an orange light, and it was just kind of bobbing along the tree line of this field, but I could see around it. It was illuminating where it was. There was nobody. There was nothing, no visible means of support. It wasn't a lantern or anything, just this orange ball, and then it just faded out and was gone. And similar, like years later, and when I saw the Brown Mountain Lights in North Carolina, some of those behaved that way. But there's all kinds of things up there in Brown Mountain, and they behave differently. Now, do you have other spook lights or things like that in your area, or phantom trains or ghost lights?
We call them the little lights in the woods here in Athens, and I started seeing them back in the 90s, but I've talked with people who've lived here their whole lives, and they're seen off and on by a wide variety of people. And in fact, there is some mention of them from the 19th century. There was a family called the Coons family. That's Koons. And the father, they had the biggest library in the county outside of Ohio University, which was chartered, I believe, in 1809. So this was in like the 1850s, something like that they lived here. And they lived on the highest point in Athens County called Mount Nebo, which is, that's kind of an interesting name. And they had a daughter who died. As happens back then, it was tuberculosis, and it was really sad. She was almost an adult. I think she was like 16 or 17. And after she died, they started seeing lights in the woods bobbing around. These were kind of a bluish color, but I think there was also a mention of an orangish color. And the father had gone not long after seeing those lights, which they took to be her ghost. He went to a little symposium in Cincinnati of spiritualists, because of course this was right at the beginning of the spiritualist belief system, and the seances and all of that sort of thing had already started. And he went there, and the person who was running the seance, the spiritualist, said that he too was a medium, and so gave him some training, and he came back and he started talking to the spirits up on Mount Nebo. And I mean, they were really pushy. They wanted him to build a spirit room, so he built a separate cabin, and he built a table, a special table. He did automatic writing and automatic drawing to like draw the plans for this table. It was very specific and precise. And then attached to that table were various musical instruments. And what would happen, he and his son were both mediums. And what would happen is people would come from all around, and from as far as I believe, Maryland and Virginia, because, of course, West Virginia wasn't West Virginia yet. It was Virginia. And, all the way down in Cincinnati and Pennsylvania. And they would come to hear the spirits play these musical instruments. And lights would zip around the dark room. And, people would try to see if they were hoaxing. They'd try to catch them with candles, and they never did. And the spirits would play just a horrible cacophony on these musical instruments. I hesitate to call it spirit music. That's what it was called. But from all accounts from that time period, it really wasn't spirit music. It was horrible noises. But yeah, we have spook lights, spirit lights, little lights. People just call them different things, and they're seen fairly frequently. We see them. I've seen them here in town, and they had gone quiet for a long time until last winter, and they started up, and I can see them in my backyard fairly frequently. I don't go outside to see them anymore. I just stay and look out my bedroom window because, I don't know, even if it's just glass, I kind of like having a little barrier. Mm-hmm. Just, I don't know what it is. So I don't feel the need to go poke it, and find out. But I've seen them very close. And in the 1990s, when I first started seeing them, it was really, really strange because a lot of people saw them who were not in the least bit believers in anything. And we saw them in groups, like groups of us together. People who didn't have strange experiences by nature would see them with us. So that was really, really strange. And so that's part of why I'm just fascinated with the little lights. And, I've listened to Tim Renner talk on Strange Familiars about it, and he sees them. And a lot of people who contact him see them. And I'm hearing more and more about people seeing them, not in places like Brown Mountain where, everybody knows they're there, but they seem to be very widely spread, particularly in the Appalachian Mountain region. And I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, there's a lot of them in the Smokies. They call them fairy lights up there, or fairy lanterns or spook lanterns. And they've been known to either lead people out of the woods or lead people farther into the woods. And it makes you wonder, because a lot of the same places that they see those in, which tend to be around Cades Cove and the north shore of Fontana Lake, which are also the most reportedly haunted areas in the Smokies. And that's also where people tend to disappear. If you follow the missing 411 and things, it kind of makes you think, is it fairy lights? And I knew a guy that it had been years and years ago. He was hunting in the park, and before it was the park. And he thought he saw somebody ahead of him with a lantern, and was using an old carbide miner's lamp on his hat, and had run out of the gas. And so lost in the woods in the dark, and he sees a light, and he thinks, okay, well, I'll follow that light out of here. And he watched it cross an area, and he followed right along behind it. And when he followed it, he stepped off about a 12 or 15-foot bluff, and fell and messed himself up and jammed the barrel of his shotgun full of dirt and everything. Oh. And he said, I watched that light. He said, it looked just like somebody carrying a lantern. It went right across there, and then when I tried, I fell. So if you made them angry or upset, and there's stories, especially among the Cherokee there, of little people in the Smokies.
Yes,
and that's who control these lights,
Yep, the Memsegwassi. They also have the Nanahe that live up in the bald tops. Those are the more human-sized people, and they're very beautiful. They're kind of like the Irish She. That's how I look at them. And the Memsegwassi are kind of like the Irish little people, or the the leprechauns, the chloricons. There's the brownies, the buka. They have so many names. That's kind of how I have them in my head. But I always when I was raising my daughter Morgana, who's on the podcast with me, I taught her, because the house where I was living at the time in Athens, we saw the lights outside all the time, and sometimes they came in the house. And I taught her never to follow them. I went with the whole will-o'-the-wisp, Pixie leading, all of the old, British Isles, UK, Irish, Scottish, Welsh beliefs about the good folk. I was like, no, don't follow that. And we heard music out in the woods and all kinds of stuff. And what was weird, when we first moved there, we were like, oh, there's a lot of, hippies and alternative people who live around Athens. When we first moved to that house, we were like, oh, we got hippie neighbors. That's cool. They probably go outside and do drumming circles at night. And that's really cool. We'll have to find them. We'd hear music and we'd go out on the porch and it would stop. We wouldn't hear it anymore. Then we'd go in the house and we'd hear it. So the first time we were like, well, they stopped playing and then they started when we went back in. No, that wasn't what it was. And we realized pretty soon that we were the neighborhood hippies. And we were pretty much surrounded with, farmers. And, they went to bed early. And we were pretty much the only ones who were up late. And they certainly weren't out in the woods playing music for anybody. But we heard it all the time. So, yeah, your friend who he got lucky he didn't break a leg or disappear.
Yeah, I think he did sprain an ankle, and he had to go back the next day and find his shotgun, but he said it was jammed into the mud about 8 inches up the barrel.
Yeah. I always tell everybody, okay, you see the lights, don't follow them. The Native Americans who were, around here had that rule as well. They always said, don't follow those, whatever they are. I think a lot of the fairy lore of the British Isles and the lore about the little people here in the United States, it's sort of rules to protect people in their dealings with non-human intelligences. And I think that, the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, was a great thing in so many ways. We got a whole new country and a whole new way of having government out of it, which is a great idea. And we got a lot of science coming out of it. That's also great. But we sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater when it came to traditions that kind of protected people. And that part, I think, is where the 18th century kind of led us astray and it wasn't so good. And then the 19th century, when the Victorian writers got a hold of fairy lore, they kind of, sanitized it and made it pretty and twee and cute and adorable and sort of pulled the fairies' teeth and made them more palatable and sweet. Yeah. And so a lot of people have ideas about that. I remember telling a group of neo-pagans about my experiences with the lights in the woods where I lived. And I could sit here for 4 hours and talk about all the things that we experienced at that house. And I still wouldn't be able to get it all out. And some of it is really unnerving and frightening, especially if you live there and they could come into your house at any time. And they did. It was, I was telling the story, and afterwards I said something to the effect of, a young woman said, "Oh, that's so cool." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, kind of, it is kind of." And she went, "Oh, I just want to see them. I would be so happy to see them." And I'm like, I'm glad I can see them because at least I know when they're around, but it's really unnerving and it's really frightening. And she was like, "Why? They sound so beautiful and they're so," and I'm like, "No, they're not sweet." And they're beautiful, but you can't trust something that shifts shape like that and talks in your brain and does, all of these things and tries to get you to follow them. Didn't they teach you stranger danger at school? Come on, you don't follow a dude who says, "Hey, come get in my van." So why are you going to follow a little skipping, glowing creature saying, "Hey, follow me into the woods"? You don't do that.
And that was one thing about the TV show Grimm. They kind of gave the teeth back to the Fae folk. And when that was in production, they filmed a lot of that in the neighborhood I lived in Portland at the time, and I loved that show. It was fascinating.
It
But
is a good show.
if you go back and look at some of the original fairy tales, the Grimm fairy tales, there's nothing cute about them at all. They're very vicious, very visceral. People get all kinds of nasty things done to them, and that's just the way it operates. I was always taught to beware of the fae folk, and there were stories in the Smokies there near where I grew up of them stealing children and leading people astray, and just you didn't want to cross them, but you didn't want to make very fast friends with them either, because they could still, they were very much tricksters, and that they would gyp you if they could and trick you into something. And, and they liked gifts of candy and tobacco and things like that. But again, they would always get the better end of the bargain, no matter what kind of deal you were trying to work with the fae folk.
Absolutely. There's a saying, I think it came from the book Celtic, wait a minute, The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries by Evans Wentz. That was his last name. He was a folklorist at the turn of the 20th century, and he went out into Ireland and Wales and Scotland and talked to the old people, before they died out, while the fairy beliefs were still very active. And he's got stories in that book that came from the 19th century, and there are names of people and place names. This wasn't people making stories to entertain people. This was people telling their experiences. And there's a thing that one of the older men said, this is how they treat us. This is how they think of things. They say, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine too. Mm-hmm. And that always sort of
I've been in a couple of relationships like that.
Yeah. That's not. Yeah, you're right. You don't want to start something. Let's just put it that way. Mm-hmm. I didn't really see the little lights much in West Virginia. My daughter did. It may be that they weren't as active at the time. It seems to be a cyclical thing, because the lights will die down here in Athens as well and then come back. Like I said, it started last winter, and it's still ongoing. And I've collected stories from people all around here, and it's nobody can tell you what it is, and everybody brings to it sort of their own understanding. Back in the 90s, when I first started seeing them, because I have such a background in fairy lore, that's what I took it as. But I know people who see them and who think of them as ghosts, or there's people who see them and who think of it as part of a UFO phenomena. And interestingly, at the time in the 1990s that we were seeing them here in Athens, in Russia, in the Ural Mountains, Jacques Vallée, in his book, The Cosmic Samizdat, which was about the UFO researchers in Russia, in the USSR, he said that, he spoke with a researcher. He was pretty much the only Western researcher who was allowed to go to the USSR and talk to these people. And they were having sightings of these little lights in the Ural Mountains at exactly the same time that we were seeing them here in Athens. And instead of seeing them as fairy folk or something paranormal in that sense, they were seeing them as some sort of adjunct to the UFO phenomena, which, reading that many, many years later, I didn't read it in the 90s when that book came out. I read it, I think, in 2006. Reading that, I was blown away. And then there are people like R.D. Six Killer Clark, who wrote the Sky People books about Native Americans and their UFO experiences. She experienced the same exact lights down in Mexico a few years back, and she was told by the people in that jungle that those were the ancestors. So I think everybody kind of comes with their own understanding of what they are, but they seem to be somewhat universal. They just are around, and people see them, and people interact with them. I don't know what it means yet, and I doubt that I ever will figure it out, but I do think that that's really fascinating.
It is. The thrill is in the chase. I mean, if we had all the answers, then what would the fun be? And like
Exactly.
Charles Fort wrote, one measures a circle beginning anywhere, so you can start anywhere and end up in the same place. And author Cisco Murdoch, who I've had on, we wrote a book together. She and I have talked about a concept of hers where the paranormal is like an onion. You peel back one layer, there's another layer,
Yep.
and you just keep peeling it back, and there's more layers. And unfortunately, with a paranormal onion, you don't get to the middle of it. If you do, there's another onion there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just a different color onion or something. I don't know. But yeah, that's what happens. So, when I was a kid, I didn't see those as much, but I did have that one story of that, seeming to be ball lightning that bounced into my grandparents' house. The farm that I visited the most often in the summer, they had a lot of UFO type sightings, lights in the sky. My grandfather was really, really fascinated with things like that. I don't think he ever thought of them as aliens. I don't really know what he thought of them, but he knew what he saw. And he was really good at being able to point out to me, because we used to watch the stars, and because out there in the country, you can see the Milky Way. It's so cool. And in Charleston, you're lucky to see the moon. And, he would point out to me, that's a satellite. You can tell because it goes straight and it blinks. And then he taught me how to recognize the FAA lights, the strobe light, and then the green and the red on either side of the airplane wings, and how to tell that. And because, of course, over West Virginia, most of the time the airplanes are flying so high up that all you can see are their lights, especially at night. And, we used to watch that, but then there would be things that were much closer than those lights, and they didn't have the FAA lights. They didn't have strobes, and they didn't fly in straight lines or in, big gentle curves the way an airplane would do. And very few helicopters ever went over back in the 70s. I don't remember very many of those. So that wasn't even an issue. But, we would see things that would do the zigzag, bright lights doing zigzags in the sky, or the going down the stairs motion, so they kind of stair step, And then his farm was right across, he was on top of a ridge, so it was really cool. We could see kind of all around. And there was another ridge right across the road. There was a big dip in the valley after you crossed the road, and then there was another big ridge. And on that ridge was the big high tension electrical lines, the big pylons that look like big giant robot guys, which, when I was a kid, I used to, make believe they could come to life and all this cool stuff, because I read science fiction, because, I was a very nerdy child. Anyway, John Keel will do that to you. We used to watch the lights kind of dip down over those electrical lines. And I didn't actually see it, but my grandfather saw a big orange light just skim right over those pylons, and it would hover, and it would get brighter and brighter and brighter, and then it would zip off really, really fast, as if it was sucking electricity out of it. And a couple of times, he and Grandma said that their electricity would kind of dim, like a rheostat had been turned in the house, and so it would dim down, and then it would, go away. And they had a TV interference a few times, and you could run outside and there'd be a weird light doing something strange in the sky. That was fairly normal, for us in the summers. Oh, let's stay up and look for the UFOs. And, we saw stuff like that. And we didn't really know what it was, but so long as they didn't land and try to kidnap us, nobody was too worried about
Mutilate
it.
your cattle or anything. And yeah, I remember the great UFO flap of '73. I was 10 years
Oh
old at the
yes.
time, and there was a lot of nights. My parents and my brother and his family, we'd go up on the highest point in the community there where we lived, and take lawn chairs and sit for hours and watch the skies. And
Oh yeah.
we saw all kinds of weird things, like uh, I saw some kind of whitish light with a red light in the middle of it one night, just a ball of light. And what you were talking about there with the UFOs flying over the power pylons, that's common occurrence in the UFO sightings and stuff. It's like they somehow can draw energy from those pylons, and then it does cause things to happen further down the line. People's electronics will go nuts, or the TV will brown out, or anything can happen. And one of the most amazing UFO sightings that I ever had was in Las Vegas, and I saw a black triangle-shaped craft that was hovering over a power station down on near the south end of the strip, and totally silent. There were no lights on it, but it was so black it blotted out the sky. And this thing, it was probably the length of a football field. And I actually pulled over and observed it. I was giving an employee of mine a ride home, and she saw it too. And we were standing, it was like about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and we're watching this thing, and suddenly, Barbara, it just like straight up and gone. I mean, no sound, nothing. It was just there, and then it was went up and out of sight. Now, again, that was in Las Vegas, Nevada, Area 51, Groom Lake. I don't know if it was one of ours, one of theirs, but it was doing something over that power station there at the end of the strip.
Yeah. See, when we talk about a giant black triangle, unless it's some kind of electric balloon, it has to make some kind of noise, unless we've had ion drivers all this time. And I don't think we have. Just the way flight works, it's got to move or have a motor that's spinning some blades to give it some lift. Physics is pretty specific about how things that are heavier than air stay in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm like, really, I mean, I know that we have all sorts of strange aircraft, but I don't believe that we have something as big as a football field that can
Yeah.
hover
I honestly
silently.
don't believe it was one of ours, but I say that
Yeah.
to err on the
But
side of
just in
caution.
exactly. Exactly. But yeah, when people talk about, black projects and stuff, like I said, I know that we have been testing drones for probably since the 70s. And so that can probably account for some of the weird sightings, but it doesn't account for all of them. It doesn't come anywhere near enough to account for all of them. But I'm not saying they're from space either, and I'm not saying they're aliens. I don't know what they are, but some of them I think are not human made because they don't follow the laws of physics as we know them to be. And that is one thing I'm pretty up on is physics and chemistry and stuff. I try to keep up with that, and it just doesn't follow the way that we understand things to work.
Mhm.
um you know so
And then speaking of electricity and electrical things, you and I were talking about this before the show. I have that propensity too that electronics misbehave around me. I can't wear a watch. Luckily, my cell phone seems to be okay. But you were describing some of the experiences you have with electricity, electronics, and technical gadgets.
Oh, I'm terrible with them. My grandfather was the same way. He couldn't wear watches. And he dowsed. He taught me how to dowse for water, and we also would find underground electrical lines and metal underground, so we could find underground pipes and stuff. One summer, he went to dowse for a spring because he was going to build a pond, and he showed me how to use the forked stick, and he had dowsing rods that he had made out of copper, and he showed me how to use those, and he was so thrilled that I could do it just as well as he could, that, for a while we'd kind of go around the neighborhood, and if somebody was looking to build a well or something or try to find a spring, we'd go and help them out. And it was funny because, he'd always show off the new country wisdom I learned when my parents came to pick me back up. And one year I learned how to, clean a fish on my own. So, it's like show and tell. My dad's standing there and he's like, look what your kid can do. And, I take the big, knife and whack its head off and, do all the gross things. And my dad's just sort of standing there with his eyes kind of bugging out because I was just as calm and methodical. I was 9 years old. And, here I am with these razor sharp knives, and he's just kind of like, oh God, the child's going to cut her fingers off. And I didn't, but so the next time it was dowsing. So I was 10, and Dad and Mom come to pick me up. Look what your kid can do. And my dad's like, oh my God, she's going to skin a rabbit. Or, she's going to shoot a bird in flight or something, but no, it was the dowsing rods. And my dad said, let me see that. And he, Grandpa was like, oh, George, I don't know that you'll be able to do it. And, 'cause you can wear a watch. And so he handed it to my dad. My dad could do it. But weirdly, my grandfather's daughter, my mom, couldn't do it. So that was interesting, but she can't wear a watch either.
No.
Now, as for electrical stuff, I was nearly struck by lightning when I was about 3 or 4. My mom and I were walking home from the grocery store, which was about 2 blocks away from her house. And she had a bag in one arm, and she was holding my hand with the other hand. And it was getting dark because, clouds were rolling in. And it looked like it was going to be what we called a good old West Virginia gully washer, because it was going to be a big downpour. You could just tell. And she started jogging me. And I was so short, I couldn't go very fast. But, she tried. And then these big, fat raindrops started hitting the ground. And so she started, trying to pull me along faster and faster. And out of the sky, with no roll of thunder to warn us, with nothing, lightning just jumped down. And instead of striking the ground or hitting us, it sort of went down and it curved around me and then went straight back up into the air, back to the cloud.
Wow.
And then there was a huge crack of thunder, at which point my mother screamed, dropped the bag, scooped me up, picked the bag back up, and just ran the rest of the way. Thank goodness she was a basketball player when she's younger. She could run fast. And of course I screamed and cried the whole way. It was horrifying, but I could smell the ozone, and my hair, I had really, I had waist length hair at the time, and my hair was all sticking out, all weird. And by the time we got home, we'd been rained on, so it wasn't still sticking out. But, I was still crying and screaming, and she was all kinds of freaked out. And we woke Dad up, but he worked nights, so he was asleep, and we woke him up by accident. And he came out, and Mom told him what happened, and he's like, "Oh, lightning doesn't do that. You just didn't see it right. It probably hit the ground, and you just didn't see it."
It can do all kinds of weird things like that. I've seen it go from cloud to cloud. Now, I've never seen it come toward the ground and then go back up, but anything's possible.
That's the only time I've seen it do that.
And one of the strangest things I've ever heard, I knew some guys that were out fishing once, and they were feeling like the hairs standing up on their necks and arms and things, and they said their fishing line started standing up.
Ooh.
And they're like, now this is weird, so we need to get out of here. And about the time they got the motor started and started out of this cove that they were in, lightning struck just the water just not far from where they were.
Yeah, that's when you can feel it build up like that. It's time to go. Mm-hmm. It's one of those, oh, too bad we can't stay. It's time to go. I'm a big believer in running away if we have to. It's a good thing. But ever since then, I've been weird and hard on electrical equipment. I I was infamous here in Athens. I worked at a not a Kinko's, but like a copy shop that was a locally owned business, and we made course materials for the university for different professors. So, every quarter we had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of course materials to make. And so we'd do things like, stay overnight and work 12-hour shifts, 24, just run the machines 24 hours a day and take turns running 12-hour shifts. And just about every quarter I would do something there was one machine I just wasn't allowed to touch at all. And in fact, they didn't even like me to stand near it. I could foul that thing up. I wasn't doing anything wrong to it. The repair guy was like, no way she's doing anything to it. You guys are superstitious. That's just nonsense. She must be putting the paper in wrong and blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't until I moved away and there were 2 quarters worth of rush periods that he didn't have to come and fix it, that he was like, hey, you haven't called me. Maybe she was screwing it up. And, the manager was like, what did I tell you? We haven't had the computers crash. We haven't had the fax machine screw up and just start dialing numbers for no reason. And, all the copiers work right. It was her. So
wow.
That was not my finest moment.
I wanted to back up just a little bit and ask you about the water dowsing. My father did that. He called himself a water witch, and he taught me how to do it. And the way he did it, it had to be a willow branch, a fresh one. Had to be like Y-shaped, and you would hold it upside down.
Yep.
And with your palms up, your thumbs out.
Yep.
And hold that Y. And Barbara, I've had that thing pull so hard before that it would literally twist the bark off in my hands.
Yep.
If I was trying to keep the point from going down. Now, I had good luck with the willow wand, was that what he called it. And he had dowsing rods that he had made. They were made out of, it was brass, like welding rods with copper handles.
Yeah.
And he could find hidden pipes, power lines, anything under the ground, he could find it. I didn't have as much luck with those as I did with the willow wand, but that's the strangest thing when you feel that pull like that, and that I'm not doing this, I'm trying to keep it from doing it, and literally just
yes,
the bark coming off in your hands. And is that the same way that you do it, palms up, thumbs up?
Yep, that is exactly how water witching's done. And my dad, because my grandpa gave him the wand first, gave him the wood, the Y-shaped wood, and told him how to do it. And my dad and grandpa sent him over an area where there was water that went from the well to the barn to the house. Dad didn't know where the water line was, but grandpa knew perfectly well where it was because he dug the hole for it and installed it. So he sent Dad across that way just to test it and see if it would work. And it twisted so hard and startled my dad so badly. Not only did some of the bark come off in his hand, because and my dad's a fairly big guy. He's strong. It pulled so hard and pulled downward so hard it jerked it out of his hands, and he was completely shocked. And he just looked down and said, "That's impossible." And of course we all laughed because, well, if it's impossible, then it wouldn't have happened that way, now would it? And my mom was like, "Oh, you're a city boy," And poor Dad, he had a lot of he was the brunt of a few jokes being a city boy. He had issues with my grandpa's cows the first time he met my grandpa, so that's a good story. It's not paranormal at all, but it's funny. He came to meet Grandma and Grandpa. And my dad is very reserved. His family, primarily German immigrants. His grandparents came from Germany. And so they're very, very reserved, not huggy, not kissy, friendly, but not overly demonstrative of such. And my grandmother hugs everybody. So that started out real well, And Grandpa was this little short. His family was mostly his father was from the Midlands and his mother was from Wales. So I have immigrants all through my family. And Grandpa was shorter than me. He was a little tiny guy, and he kind of looked up at my dad and was like, kind of made a noise. And Mom was like, I married him, because they ran away to get married. And Grandpa's like, we got to go get the cows. Judy, come on. Come with your brothers. And Dad said, can I help? And Grandpa looks at him and says, I don't know, can you? And he's like, well, yeah, I can do that. He's like, all right, I'm going to have you guard the gate. I'm going to have you open the gate when you hear us bringing the cows up out of the field. And I want you to open the gate and make sure they go in. Can you do that? Yeah, I can do that. So my grandma, he should have known that there was something up, because my grandma climbs up on the fence in the upper part of next to the gate, in the upper part of the next field, and sits down and watches. He should have known. And my mom and her two brothers and her younger brother, who at that time was about 8, they go down the hill into the lower field with Grandpa to go get the cows. And they didn't have horses. They just, went behind them and herded them by hand. And so you can hear them. They're going, go on, girl, go, babe, go this way, blah, yeah, and yelling at them and flapping their shirts and, making noise. And the cows are kind of and stomping. You could hear them coming up the field. You see a little bit of dust coming up. And my grandma's sitting there, and she looks over. She's like, well, George, you better open the gate. And he's like, oh, yeah. So he opens the gate. He holds it open, and she's like, you need to stand there and make sure they go in. And he's like, okay, I will. And so, he gets the first glimpse of him, and the first cow that comes up is huge, and she has horns. And she stopped and looked at him, and he looked at her. And my grandma said, now, make sure she goes in. And so my dad starts gesticulating as if he was an air traffic controller. And she looks at that and is like, yeah, right. And she turned tail and went right back down the hill, right past my grandfather and my uncles and my mom. And all the other cows followed her. And they're all, and they're going down the hill. And my grandpa comes stomping up. He stomps up to my father, and he says, damn it, George, I said to make sure they went in. And he's like, well, I tried. He said, but he's like, it's that lead cow. Now she don't let her buffalo you like that. Now you're boss. And he said, now I want you to take a stick, and I want you to hit her with it. And he's like, okay. She's the lead cow. She's my best cow. But whatever she does, all the other cows do. So you just have to make sure she goes through, and then the other ones will go through. You got that? And he's like, yes, I've got that. So, okay, we're going to go get him again. So he goes down the hill, and they come up, and my dad's standing there, and he's got a stick, and I want to say it's maybe a 1/2 inch thick. I don't know what he thought he was doing, and I reckon my grandma could have told him better than that, but she didn't, because I think she thought it was funny. And the cows come up, and here comes Babe, the lead cow, and she sees that it's the same person standing there, and he's got a stick, and he waves at her. So come on, cow, come on, Babe, go in the gate. And he sort of waves the stick, and she takes a few steps forward and looks at him, and then she kind of lowers her head so as to point out how big her horns are and how sharp they are. And my dad kind of swipes at her with the stick, and she just tosses her head and turns. And so he hits her with the stick, and it breaks off. So, it was really pathetic. And back down the hill, they go right past my grandfather, who at this point is now starting to cuss, and my mom and her brothers, and they're all laughing. And my grandfather stomped up and he grabs what my dad describes as a tree branch and hands to him and says, that's not a stick, George. And, Dad throws it down on the ground. Like, I didn't actually hit her with that little tiny twig. I didn't, and he's like, see this? And I want you to hit her. I want you to hit her. If she tries to do anything, I want you to hit her, and she'll know who's boss then, and she'll go into that damn field, and then you close the gate because the other ones will follow her, and it'll be all over. So you just go right ahead. And so my dad's like, okay. And, my grandmother said for years that she felt like he was about to cry, and she almost felt sorry for him, but it was so funny. She just couldn't help it. And they went back down the hill. They bring the cows back up. And this time, Babe stops and looks at him and is just like, it's you again. And he's like, yeah, it's you again. But, my dad didn't know anything about cows, but he knew how baseball bats worked. And he said that thing was about the weight of a Louisville Slugger. He said, so he put it in both hands. And she lowered her head to try to intimidate him again, and then sort of scuffled in the dirt with her hooves like, she was some kind of fighting bull or some crap. And my dad just looked at her. He's like, no, you get in there. And she was just like, ugh, she snorted at him. The other cows are just standing there watching. And he walked straight up to her, and he said, I drew that branch back, and I started to swing, and he said, as God is my witness, I didn't mean to hit her that hard, but she rose her head up right into the path of it. He said he hit her in the head, it cracked and broke, and she went down to her knees out cold.
Wow.
Just straight down. The other cows looked at him and were like, and they went right into the gate. and so he's closing the gate and putting the broken stick down, and my grandpa comes up, and the cow is still laying there, and my grandmother fell off the fence because she's laughing so hard. And he looks down, and he looks up at my dad, and my dad is like sheepish, and he's starting to stammer. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And my dad and my grandpa says, damn it, George, I told you to hit her, not kill her. Now that was my best cow. At which point, my mom went and checked on her. She was breathing. She's like, she's breathing, Dad. She got up, staggered, to her feet, and my uncles kind of helped the cow up, and she just sort of staggered and looked up at my dad and sort of, ugh, and just went right to the gate and stood and waited for him to open it, and she went right in. But that was my poor dad, poor city boy.
And that's one thing, living on a farm, around a farm. My grandparents on my mom's side were dairy farmers, and then my dad's side of the family, they were tobacco and pig farmers and a little bit of everything. But there's so many funny stories. There's so many amusing things that happened on the farm. And the whole storytelling, and I think that's where I get it. I come by it honestly, being a raconteur. It was, you go to their house in the wintertime, they couldn't farm in the wintertime, so they'd sit around the wood stove in the parlor and tell stories. It was better than the radio.
Yes, it was.
You didn't hear anything like that on the radio.
Oh, yeah. I had my dad tell that story. It's really funny when he tells it. He could probably be a stand-up comedian just telling that story. And I've had my grandpa tell it too. So it was funny hearing both sides of it. We had all sorts of things happen on that farm. We had a Mothman incident on that farm.
Oh, wow. Tell us about that.
Well, all right. So my youngest uncle, he was the one who was 8 when Mom got married to Dad. He was probably, I want to say 17 when this happened. And I was spending large chunks of the summer that year. So I was there, and then a couple of my boy cousins were there. And, they wanted to camp out. And we had been sky watching, and there were some weird lights doing their weird light thing. It wasn't unusual there. And they set up a tent in one of the cow pastures that the cows weren't in. And the boys were going to stay in the tent with my uncle. And I stayed in the house like a sensible person, because I didn't want to sleep on the ground. So I stayed in the house with Grandma and Grandpa. And we go to bed. And now, while we were watching the stars, you got to tell scary stories when you have campouts. And so, this was in probably, I want to say, 75, 76, something like that. My cousin was like a year older than me. And I had been reading John Keel. Mothman Prophecies had come out. And my dad had gotten it. And I'd been reading that. So, when we were telling scary stories, I was telling some of the stories from the Mothman Prophecies. And so we started talking about Mothman and, the big red eyes and all of that. And people, how terrifying it was. And, then, Grandpa told about the ball lightning and Grandma told about the dog disappearing. Now, the problem is when you tell scary stories in campouts, you should probably not tell the ones that actually happened. You should probably, make stuff up. But apparently my cousins were not going to sleep real well. And I was still reading, John Keel in bed, and I hear a huge scream. And, the whole household, we all came running out. My grandpa, in his pajamas, and Grandma in a robe, and I had on my pajamas, and we came out, and it's dark as dark can be because of course, we didn't have street lights. It's the country. And we see flashlights in the field going just crazy. And it's the cousin who's a year older than me screaming, "It's Mothman! It's Mothman! Oh my God, it's Mothman!" And my uncle's going, "It is not Mothman. It can't be Mothman. Hold the flashlight still." We could hear all kinds of crazy things happening. The dogs were barking and all kinds of things. And so we went, running down the hill towards the flashlights with our flashlights. And I saw it. It was down by the fence, by the barbed wire fence. It's down there. It's dark, and there were eyes. They were bright red. There were eyes. They were shining eyes. And he was just losing it, and he was crying, which I found to be amusing because I was younger than he was. So, but I was kind of excited because if it was Mothman, that meant that we got to see it. So down the hill, and my uncle is trying to grab the flashlight away from my cousins, who were flashing it all up in the air and sideways and, just being ridiculous about it. And Grandpa gets there and he's like, "Where'd you see it, boy?" And my cousin pointed down to the bottom of the hill, the bottom of the field. My grandpa, who had a much steadier hand with his flashlight because he wasn't terrified, just kind of, pointed it in that direction slowly and, methodically, scanned the area. Yeah. And we got a flash of red eyes. And so Grandpa stopped, reeled that back in, brought it back around. It was a cow. It was a cow trying to figure out why a young boy was trying to pee on her down at the bottom of the hill, because he apparently had to pee, and instead of going back to the house, he decided it was easier to go down the hill, and he took his flashlight with him to make sure he wouldn't run into the barbed wire fence, and it flashed on her eyes, and they reflected, and then to his mind looked very bright red, and she just looked at him and he never lived that down. We were so mean to him about that. He was, his first girlfriend, we told her about that. I don't think he ever forgave us for that, but, it was funny that, "It's Mothman, it's Mothman." Nah, it was a cow. It was just a cow. And she was one of the nice ones. She wasn't even one of the really mean ones. She just was like, "Dude, I was just standing here eating and you come over here and make stinky water right in my face. What am I supposed to do, So we had all kinds of silly things happen. That's our Mothman story, except that uncle used to go to the McClintock Wildlife Station a lot, and he'd camp out there. And one time he went, and he was looking in the igloos, those infamous TNT storage areas that they had. Some of them had holes in the top that, that was one of the entrances and exits, and it also provided some air movement because you don't want your TNT to get too warm.
Mm-hmm.
And they were dilapidated by the 70s. They were, and now they're really unsafe. In fact, not that long ago, one of them exploded. But he had gone into one and was looking around it. And he said he looked up along the opening at the top with his flashlight, and it had scores in the concrete that looked like claw marks on the edges on both sides that went from the edge of it and then down the walls, the ceiling a little bit, it just sort of looked scraped in by something. So, of course, he decides to climb it from the top and look down so he can get a good close look at it. And he said that it was something, it wasn't done while the concrete was wet. He poked at it and the concrete was crumbly, and something had scored it, and he said it looked like claw marks. And that's when he decided that he should maybe go to a different part of the wildlife area and not poke around in that place anymore. He also was a good person for, too bad we can't stay, time to go. And so he decided that time it was a little bit too creepy for him. And rightly so. He also had instances of missing time and things, and he won't talk about it. I overheard him talking with Grandma about it once, and it was exceedingly creepy, and that I did not like that myself. But yeah. He didn't see Mothman out there. And then, none of us saw Mothman on the farm. We saw a cow. So.
Reminds me of a story my grandfather used to tell. There was something going around about a ghost in a graveyard or something, and he was going to go up there and see what it was. And sure enough, went out one foggy night, and he sees something white moving around up there, and he got right up on it, and it licked him. And it was a farmer's cow that had figured out a way to get in the graveyard at night, and it was licking, the moisture or something off the tombstones. And people just saw a white shape moving in the graveyard, and like, oh, it's a ghost.
If it was limestone, it could have tasted kind of salty.
That's what I was
thinking. He could have been
getting
calcium from it.
Yeah.
Because there's calcium silicate in it.
But yeah, he was all prepared to grab it, and then it licked him.
Being licked by a ghost, that's not cool.
Now,
that's
now we talked about Mothman. Something else I'd like to ask about. What about the Flatwoods Monster? Now, that was there in West Virginia, too. That's one of the strangest cases as far as the description and the artist representations of it that I've ever seen. I've heard it called everything from a demon to a fallen angel to who knows what.
The stories about the army showing up kind of makes me wonder if it wasn't some sort of either a psyop to see if they could, create a monster sighting. See, and the reason I think that, I don't know if you've ever heard about the artists and movie makers who during World War II created ghost armies to fool the Germans. They had inflatable tanks and inflatable fake airplanes and stuff, and they'd assemble a fake army, and they'd put out radio signals and radio broadcasts with code in it and everything, the code that they knew the Germans had broken. And they'd do everything to make them believe that the army was where it wasn't. And it worked. It worked exceedingly well. And it was kind of the first really amazing psyops that were ever done, and it was a joint venture between the Americans and the British. If you can ever look up a documentary about the Ghost Army, it's fascinating to watch. And so I do kind of wonder. I'm not saying that nothing happened. I'm sure something happened. But I do wonder, because the Army came in really fast after that, and I don't think it was just a meteor. Country people, people think country people are dumb. And I think that that's not a good way to look at it. They think that people in West Virginia who live out in the sticks are stupid people. I'm not saying that there aren't any stupid people there. There are, but I'm related to a couple of them. And, but if you live in the country, you have to have decent observational skills in order to do the things you need to do to survive. You have to be able to know what's going on at any given time with animals and plants, and, you have wild animals that can decimate your livestock. You got, all kinds of weather to watch out for. You got to pay attention to that. You're always got to be on alert. And I don't really appreciate the whole idea that country people are stupid, because I don't think that's the case. They may be uneducated, but that's not even necessarily the case either. My grandfather could build just about anything. He was always reading popular mechanics and popular science, and I was always reading them behind him because there wasn't much else to read in the house. And if I ran through all the stuff I brought with me, then that's what I was going to read, that or the encyclopedia, which I also read. But be that as it may, I've always wondered if it wasn't some sort of a psyop to see what they could do to convince people that they had seen a monster or something,
No.
The weird gas that was let off by the thing that made the woman and the children sick and the dog really sick. That also makes me wonder if it wasn't some sort of a chemical weapon test, or it went awry. It wasn't supposed to be that strong, but it was. I wonder. I don't know, but it is the weirdest looking thing,
It almost looked like it was wearing a dress, and it had the Ace of Spades thing up behind it, and just strange.
I mean, it could have been an interdimensional robotic thingamahoozy. I don't know. It's weird, but I do believe happened, because the lady who went up there with the kids was a perfectly reasonable individual. Everybody always said, it wasn't like she was, a drunkard or anything. And she was reasonably well educated. I don't think she was dumb. And I know she wasn't making anything up, because everybody got sick and were examined by doctors. So something happened, but I can't tell you what it was. Now we have lots of Bigfoot sightings also in West Virginia. Braxton County is one of the places where, in the 60s, there was a lot of Bigfoot sightings, 60s and 70s. And my uncle did go and camp out there and look for it. He didn't find it. He was very disappointed, but he did see a bear. And then he kind of got the idea, well, maybe people were seeing a bear, but I pointed out, okay, these are people who live near bear, and you recognized it as a bear. I bet they'd recognize it as a bear too. And he's like, well, yeah, okay. You're probably right. But yeah, West Virginia is well and truly endowed with strange things. We've got ghosts. We've got haunted insane asylums. We've got, just, and the thing is almost everybody who lives there has either experienced something themselves or someone they know has.
Yeah, and I think Keel's 200 miles. I think that's very generous. I think it's more like 20 miles, especially in the southern Appalachians. There's not any little community that you can go to down there that doesn't have a crybaby bridge or it has a haunted house or some sort of mystery or strangeness or something that's happened there. And that's one of my favorite things to do, is to travel into these little towns and communities. And I've always found that if you talk to the young people, like the high school age kids, they know all the creepy stuff. And then if you find the much older people, the people in their 70s and 80s, they know all the creepy stories too.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
now, you mentioned ghost stories. What are some of the local ghost stories that are local to where you grew up or were raised?
Well, this wasn't a ghost story that people knew about, but it was a thing that happened to me when I was in high school. I was with my boyfriend. We went to see his grandparents, and they lived out in the country too, but it's a different county. And it was Roane County, and his grandparents lived on the same farm that his father and uncles had grown up on. So, they'd been there for 60 years, something like that. And it was much more rural than where my grandparents were at, I thought. The houses were farther apart, and the roads, oh my God, the roads. West Virginia roads, I'm just going to say right here, right now, oh my God, you just have to grow up with them to drive them real well, I think. They're horrifying. Even when they're nice, they were built by people who I don't think ever envisioned cars ever going fast, ever.
Or passing each other side by side. Get that a lot in rural Tennessee. Just little narrow roads, and if somebody's coming, you have to literally get over on the shoulder to let them pass, or they have to let you pass.
Yeah, and it's just, I like what Tim Renner said in my last podcast, because we interviewed him. He said, I always think of West Virginia as Pennsylvania on steroids. He's like, because we have hills and mountains, but their hills and mountains are serious. Like, they mean it. I'm like, yes, I grew up with that. And you get switchback turns and all of these things that are just ridiculous. And, so the place where my boyfriend's grandparents lived had roads like that. They were just horrible. And there weren't very many of them that were paved. So, and I was used to dirt roads anyway, but this was exceptionally bad. I really didn't care for it. Anyway, so we get there, and, he's telling me about this house. It's close to his grandparents' farm. It's like, you go down the road. It's typical West Virginia. Go down the road till you get to the oak tree. And then you see a track that goes off in the woods. That's an old lumber road. And then it ain't been used in a long time. And it might be overgrown. And you go that way. And then there's a fork in the road. And you take the left fork, not the right one. The right one will take you to a precipice. And you'll fall down, And it tells you all these things. And then there's the holler and this and that and blah, blah. And he says, there's a house out there. He said, I haven't been there for a couple of years. But it's where Aunt Melissa used to live. I said, who's Aunt Melissa? And he said, well, she was a lady who lived out there by herself. Her husband had died, and she never had children. But all the neighborhood kids used to go and visit her because she baked cookies for the kids because she didn't have kids of her own. And so she'd sit, and they'd sit on the porch swing with her, and they'd have cookies, and they'd talk. And it was real nice to visit with Aunt Melissa. He said, my dad told me about her. And I said, well, what about the house? And he's like, well, it's fallen down. It's derelict. She didn't have any children to leave it to. And so after she died and they took her out of the house and buried her, it just sat there. And so the woods took it over. Well, okay, that sounds really kind of cool. He's like, there's trees that are growing up through it. And yeah, that sounds really cool. He didn't say anything about a ghost. Nothing. So, of course, I'm like, yeah, sure, let's go. He said, yeah, there's cool stuff. Like there's an antique stove from like the teens in there, an old wood stove. And, there was some furniture in there, but I expect people have, taken the furniture out by now. And So we'll go and look. And he said there was stuff in the kitchen the last time I was there. There were some dishes and things. And I was like, okay, well, we'll go, So we go, down the road a piece till we get to the oak tree, and then we take the fork in the road, not to the right, but to the left, and, avoided the holler, and the rutted road was really rutted. There had been loggers out there within the past 10 years, and so those big, heavy trucks had pretty much destroyed it. So it was kind of hard going, even though there was technically a road. They were, ruts were about a foot deep in it, all through it. So we're kind of, staggering and clambering and making a mess of ourselves in the mud. And we're going and going. And I'm like, how much farther is it? Because it felt like we had been going for hours. And he said, oh, it's not that much farther. I'm like, how long have we been out here? Because it's getting hotter and hotter. And then all of a sudden it gets cold. And I realized the tree canopy had just pretty much grown over the road. So there was no light coming down. I mean, at first I actually thought that a storm was coming up, but, you could see a little bit of sky through the leaves and it was blue. So I was, how much farther? And he's like, oh, not much farther. And I'm starting to feel funny. I'm starting to feel kind of antsy and twitchy. I'm starting to feel like I'm being watched, and I'm looking around. I'm like, you got any wildcats or anything out here? You got like bobcats or, this is before coyotes were really very prevalent on this side of the Mississippi. So I wasn't worried about that. I'm like, but are there wild dogs? Are there packs of wild dogs around here? Because he's like, no. He said, now there might be a bobcat or two, but they're not going to mess with us. We're people and they're little. And I was like, okay. And, we're walking and then the back of my head starts to hurt and really hurt, like a heavy, like it almost felt like there was a pressure back there, like something pushing on me. And then I started getting really anxious and I was like, my head really hurts. How much farther? He said, we're just going to turn this corner, this corner here, and it's going to be right off that corner. And I'm like, okay, because he's been saying it's not too much farther this whole time. And we get there and I look up and there's this house and there's a tree growing out the roof and the porch is caved in and there's the windows the windows are all broken out and the windows have vines and stuff growing through them that have kind of broken it out. There's some kudzu kind of stuff happening and, Virginia creeper, I think is probably what it was, not kudzu, but, there were vines all growing over it and it really just looked pretty creepy, like really, really scary. And I just looked at it and I was like, and my head really hurt. And I was just like, you know what? I don't know about this. And he's like, oh, come on, stop it. I'm like, okay. So I follow him. We go in the back door and the floors are like caved in. And there's been animals denning in there. You could smell like fox. You could smell foxes. And I'm like, there's been foxes here and, better hope they don't have rabies. And I was pretty much, we kind of looked around. I saw the antique wood stove. That was cool. It was cast iron. It was probably from the 19th century. It was really cool. But you know what? I was pretty much done at that point. And he's like, I'm going to go upstairs. I was like, you know what? None of these floors look good. I don't think you should do that. There's not even a railing on those stairs. Why don't we just go? And he's like, no, stop being. He didn't listen. He's like, stop being, a scaredy cat. I'm going to go. And so he starts climbing up the stairs and I'm just like, I can't even. And my head just was throbbing and I was like, I don't even want to. No. And so I just left the house and I walked around the outside to a window that was on, on the ground floor. And it showed the stairs that he went up right directly across from me, and I'm just watching for him to come down the steps or fall through the ceiling because it was that bad. And so I'm like, oh my God, if he falls and breaks his leg, I'm gonna have to carry him out of here. And oh my God. because this is before cell phones. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, oh my God. So I'm watching, and I saw a shimmer, and what it was like an opposite of a silhouette. So instead of being black, it was white. And instead of being a shadow, it was a little bit shimmery and shiny. And it was in the shape of a woman wearing a dress that went, about halfway down her calf. And shoes. I could see the shoes. And her hair was done, pulled back in a bun. I could see it, up against her neck. I couldn't see facial features. But she just kind of walked down and sat down in the middle of the steps and turned and looked at me. And I'm looking at her, and she's looking at me. And I was like, okay. And that was the first ghost I had ever seen that I could figure out was a ghost, that I was like, that looks like a ghost. And so I'm just sitting there, and we're staring at each other. And she kind of leans her arms on her knees and just, she even sort of spread her skirts down over her knees. You know how women do when they sit down, just sort of automatically. She did it just as automatically as a living woman would. And I was like, oh my God. So I'm standing there, and I'm like, I'm going to leave him in this house if he doesn't hurry up. And he finally comes down the stairs, and he goes right past her. And I'm just sitting outside the window with my elbow on the windowsill watching. And he comes out, and he comes around, and he kind of peeks in the window past me. He goes, what are you looking at? I said, nothing. And he said, no, what are you looking at? I said, nothing. And he said, do you see what looks like a lady sitting there? And I said, yes, I do, which is why I told you not to go up those stairs. You walked right past her or through her or something. And he said, wow. Yeah, I think it's time to go. I went, yeah, it was time to go before we got here. And so I waved to her, and he said, I reckon that's Aunt Melissa. And I said, well, I'm good. Yeah, I reckon so. And so I said, thank you, Aunt Melissa. I'm sorry he, walked in your house and, walked through you. That wasn't very nice, and that wasn't polite, and I'm sorry. And so we started leaving, and I looked back one last look before we turned that big corner, just as we were about to turn it. And I could see the outline of her looking out the upstairs window watching us go. And that was the first time I had seen a ghost, and I was just like, okay, But that was one of the times, that's when I realized that if I see something and I'm not sure if somebody sees it, I'll ask them if they see something before I tell them what I see, so I don't influence what they see. Because I know I'm stubborn, and I'll believe what I see even if somebody sees something different. But I don't know that necessarily it would work the other way.
Wow, that's an amazing story. That's full body apparition, right? You said it was a silhouette.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. She looked like a white silhouette instead of a black one.
That's an interesting way to describe it. I've never heard it described quite that way, but that makes perfect sense.
I have since wondered if it wasn't a time slip, and maybe she could see us as little white silhouettes hanging around in her house and outside of her house. It kind of made me go, but that was just a few years ago that thought kind of, went through my head. I was like, I wonder if that's why she acted so lifelike, that she was alive on another side of a time slip or a time rift or something.
And those, to me, those are just as fascinating, if not more so, than ghost stories. Some of the time slips and cases of missing time things. I've had a couple of those myself, just very brief ones, but it's just so unsettling when you realize, I don't know where I've been for the last 2 hours, and I haven't had anything to drink. I haven't taken anything. I'll go ahead and tell a story. I was a teenager in high school, and a guy that I lived in the subdivision with, we were out riding our bicycles and BMX bikes, and it was about 7, 8 o'clock in the evening, and the subdivision I lived in, they had done it in different phases. And the third phase, they had the roads put in, but it was still just wooded lots. They hadn't started any of the construction. We were riding up there. We were riding along side by side, and I remember hearing a noise in the woods, and I kind of looked up toward the trees. And then the next thing I remember, we're still on our bikes, but we're going the other direction. Still pedaling along, and didn't say a word. We went back down the hill. He went into his driveway. I went on up to mine and went inside. And my parents were like, "Where you been? We were getting worried about you." And I thought I'd only been out a few minutes, but it was, I think, like I said, it was around 8. It was almost 11 when I went in. So there was 2 hours there. I have no idea what happened, where I was. And I talked to my friend about it later on, and he's like, "I don't know." He said, "I thought it was just me." He said, "But that was the weirdest thing that I've ever had happen to me." And we both agreed, and neither one of us had any memory of what happened or where, other than we were going this direction, and then the next thing we were going the other direction, and over 2 hours had passed.
No, I don't like that at all.
Don't like the idea. As far as I know, I wasn't probed or prodded or anything like that, but still, it's unsettling.
Oh, yeah. Missing time stories weird me out, seriously. I've had instances, and they're small, and it's usually when we were driving that we'd get somewhere faster than we should or get somewhere slower than we should, and it was always a specific piece, 2 different specific pieces of highway, both of them in West Virginia. I wonder if that means anything. But and it happened with my boyfriend, the one, who wandered through a ghost in a very rude fashion. And it's happened with my current husband. And I don't know. I mean, it could be road hypnosis, but we would check it with clocks, and it would be going from, one place to another, the same place. It was one exact particular stretch of road. And then there was this weird stretch of road in Connecticut that I traveled late one night with some friends, and I don't think it was missing time per se, but it took forever, and it hadn't taken forever the first time that we did it, and there was fog, and it just felt like there were things in the fog, and there was a radio station coming out of Long Island Sound, and it was a blues radio program. And I don't know, something happened. I don't know if I was on the Psychic Friends Network with the DJ or what, but I would say, I'd really like to hear Buddy Guy right now, and the next song would be Buddy Guy.
I've had that happen before, where a song pops into your head, and then you get in the car and turn on the radio, and that's the song that's on the radio.
Exactly. I don't listen to the radio that often anymore, so it doesn't happen as often as it used to. But that night it just kept going. It was like Buddy Guy, Coco Taylor. And it wasn't just really.
It was a singular occurrence. It was some sort of small flap or something going on there.
Yeah,
sounds like.
It was. We called that place Spooky Highway ever after that, and we didn't travel it again. The last time I traveled it was with my current husband last year or the year before. I think it was the year before. And I was like, "Hey, this is Spooky Highway." And he's like, "Well, it's daytime, so it's not so spooky." And yeah, I ain't turning on the radio to see if you can still talk psychically to the DJ. So
there are places like that, and in East Tennessee, where I grew up and learned to drive on those back roads, there were roads that just had a particular feeling to them, or didn't feel right, didn't have the right feeling. And don't know that I ever had any time slips. I know of a road where other people told me they have driven through there and saw things that had been there decades ago that weren't there anymore, and then they went and drove back, and it was as like it was supposed to be. One of it happened to be my grandparents' dairy farm, and when TVA backed up the Clinch River and created Melton Hill Lake, they left that dairy farm sitting on, the barn, sitting on a 1/4 acre of land. But I had somebody tell me they'd gotten lost in that area where I'd lived, and the road there, Sparks Road, is named after my grandparents. And they said, yeah, there was a dairy farm and all these cows, and they were naming things. There was no dairy farm anywhere near there at that time. This was in the 80s, sometime in the 80s. But the area where they described, and I got a map and showed them, and they're like, well, yeah, but there wasn't a cove there, and the barn wasn't on a little piece of land like that. It was, and there were cows and people, and I'm like, you saw something from years ago, some kind of little slip there, and I would love to have seen that, but I had some strange experiences on that road, but never any time slips or anything like that. Saw
Wow.
some weird things, and in the little cove there by where the barn was, I've got a story in one of my books where a couple of guys saw a turtle the size of a Volkswagen
Oh my God.
out in a little cove in the lake. So it was a strange place to grow up. That whole area felt off. The thing in the ditch, one of my stories there, the ghost kittens. I could hear
Oh
kittens
yeah, I read
under
that.
the house. Yeah, and no clue. I heard that for years. The last time I heard those kittens under the house, I was 15 years old. It was the last night I spent in the house because my furniture had already been moved to the new house. But I'd heard them since I was like 7 or 8 years old. Nothing but a crawl space. I went under there at least a dozen times, Barbara. There were no kittens under there. And one of my friends from school, he had heard them too when we were in my bedroom, but my parents never heard them. So again,
Huh.
it's one of those weird things that only kids could hear or something. But that whole area was kind of off. And I think there are places like that where it's not a haunted house, or it's the land. It's the land itself. And particularly in
Yeah.
Appalachia, there tends to be places like that. Even the Cherokee, there are places that they will avoid, that they won't go
Oh
near.
yeah.
Just
Oh yeah.
and it's woods. There's not anything there. Hadn't been anything there probably in forever.
Yeah. Yeah. They were really particular about certain places that they just did not go. Um, Certain caverns they wouldn't go into. You know, there were. Well, they didn't go to the bald tops in the Smokies with the big granite boulders that because they said the Nanahe lived there. Although they do have a story, I read it not that long ago, where I think it was the Creek were gonna, attack the Cherokee, and they got a warning from who they took to be Nanahe people, came and said, "We'll hide you. You can come live with us." And they, some of the tribe went with them,
Hmm.
and disappeared into the mountains and didn't come back. Um, it. I think you're right. I think it's. I mean, I've written about Appalachia before. I think it's interesting. It's the second or third oldest mountain chain in the world,
Mm.
and I think that says a lot. I think when some geographical feature is that old, then there's energy
Yeah,
that
there's
builds
got
up.
to be stored energy and history, plus all the caves, limestone caverns, and things
Oh
that are
yeah,
throughout that whole area. Not only Tennessee, but up into Kentucky, where you have Hellier and now Somerset and all that popping off and on up to West Virginia
oh
and
yeah,
in that area.
and
Fascinating stuff.
I do think that well, there are magnetic anomalies through the region. I've been looking at USGS maps, and there's a fair number of magnetic anomalies. Some of them correspond with old coal fields and oil, but some of it doesn't. And there is the limestone and the sandstone has a fair amount of quartz in it, which, as we know, quartz can hold an electrical charge. Um, that may have something to do with it. I don't know,
Yeah,
but
I've heard about, they call it the stone tape theory,
yeah,
where some of the hauntings that seem to be residual, where it's the same thing over and over and over, that maybe that's what it is, that it's somehow stored, and then the conditions are just right that it replays it. Because you think about that, an audio tape or videotape, that's just mylar with ferrous oxide on there, and
yeah,
then the recording heads change that around. So I could see that, and we know that quartz has power. I mean, there's quartz movement in the watch if you can wear one, and you can make a radio out of a quartz crystal
oh yeah,
if you know what you're doing with a razor blade and some copper wire. So I think there's, and somebody in the chat here earlier said magic is just science that we don't understand yet. And I think that was very profound. That makes a lot of sense.
Oh, it does. It does. I've always believed that, and that's one of the things my grandfather, the dowsing one said. He said that we just don't know why it works yet. But he thoroughly believed that it was something in the electrical or electromagnetic field that humans have. He said that he believed that his and mine were of one sort. And he said, and interestingly, he's like, your mother's kind of like that, but apparently your dad is too. He said that might explain why, you dowsed like, you didn't really have to learn how to do it. You just did it naturally.
Yeah, that was me. Once I learned how to hold the wand right, it just worked. And then on my mother's side, they were all part of the spiritualism movement from the turn of the last century, and they grew up, holding seances and doing the table tippings or table tappings.
Yeah.
My grandmother, she called herself a gypsy witch, but she was really a granny witch, as they're known in Appalachia, a kitchen witch.
Yeah.
And she told fortunes, she read tea leaves, coffee grounds, animal entrails, which I was always just stunned by that. And then I did some research on that, and what it was, they would butcher hogs in the fall, and she would pick one hog out, and when they butchered that one, she would want to study its insides, and she would predict the crops and the next season of things with some fair accuracy. But when I read up on that, found out that goes back to like Viking times,
Rome.
where
Yeah,
they
it goes to
would
Rome.
kill an animal, and study the entrails to predict how victorious they might be in battle.
Yeah, even in the Bible, they talk about you're not supposed to do that. Back when they did sacrifices to God in the Old Testament, there's a passage. Now, of course, I don't remember where it is, but the priests were allowed to do the sacrifices, but there had become a prohibition against reading the entrails.
Mm-hmm.
And that was considered witchcraft, and that was not to be done. But the Roman priests did it all the time. That was part of making a sacrifice to the gods, or the god, whichever god. And you're right, the Vikings did that too. I think the Druids did as well.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of what they practiced came from, because I think my mom's family were mainly from England. My dad said they were Scotch-Irish. That's where I'm like you. I've got the green eyes, and when I was younger, I had a lot of auburn highlights in my hair. The first time I grew my beard out, it was red, which kind of shocked me when I was
like my dad.
a teenager. Later on, it darkened up. Now the auburn's been replaced by gray, but there's just a lot of the Scots-Irish in there. They brought a lot of the traditions and the folklore and the stories and everything with them. And that's just the whole area of Appalachia. It's, from what I've heard, it reminded them a lot of where they were from in Ireland and Scotland, and therefore, this looks like home. Let's stay here. Because there was one Irish family. They were a man that I've got some stories from in my book named Otto. He was first generation American, and his family had come over from Ireland, and they lived, like miles out in the woods, and they liked that area. They didn't mind that. They were very hard scrabble people, worked hard, and now they farmed and moonshined and did a little bit of everything. That's just the way it was, and probably to a degree still is. But I remember talking to him when I was just a small child and hearing some of his stories. And I would almost have to get my dad to translate, because my dad was from that area. This is over on the Cumberland Plateau in Middle Tennessee. And I'd ask him something about where his people, where he was from, and he said Harlan. And I thought he was talking about Harlan, Kentucky. And and then after we left, I'm like, Dad, are they from Harlan? He said, no, he's saying Ireland. Yeah, Harlan.
Ireland.
But he was redheaded like that, and lived to be probably in his 80s or 90s, but he was just a fascinating gentleman. I've got a lot of stories that I haven't written yet that I collected from him. And he was one of these. He was a trapper, a ginseng hunter, moonshiner, did whatever he had to do to get by. And came from a huge family, and then had a huge family of his own, and just fascinating stories. And I would write them down, but he was one of these people that they were a little reticent to tell you the stories, but then once you got them going, sometimes it was like you had to drag it out of them with a log chain. And I remember once I took a little cassette player with me. Now, back then, little, it was the size of a couple of paperback books,
I was going to say it wasn't that little.
And
but
he
yeah.
just totally demurred. He'd be like, no, don't want you to record my voice. So I had to rely on note taking, and I wished I'd spent more time listening to him. Same with my grandmother. She passed away when I was 13 years old, the one on my mom's side. Again, she was the gypsy witch, the fortune teller, and just so many stories. But she looked like a witch. I was scared of her. If the video I have on 13 Past Midnight, Granny's Ghost, that's her in the picture. And me with my first motorcycle, I think I was about 8, 9, 10 years old, and she's looking on with great disdain. But that's her. She looked like a witch, and I was scared of her. And because I was born with a caul over my face, which a veil, they call it, all that is, it's part of the amniotic sac, the afterbirth. But in her superstitious mind, that marked me. I was a very special child and had second sight and all this. And none of my other cousins, and she had 10 kids, had my mom and 9 boys.
Oh, Lord.
None of my other cousins had been born like that. So I was the special one. So she would get me alone in her sewing room and tell me all these wild tales and superstitions and omens and portents and just scare the daylights out of me. And then she would bribe me with a dollar bill or a Hershey bar or something to not tell my other cousins. So but I wish I hadn't been so afraid of her and had at least another 13 years with her, because I could probably write a book just on her superstitions. She had one for everything.
Oh, yeah.
And, certain rules and things that you had to observe or obey. And if you didn't do that, you're going to bring bad luck on you. But if you did do it, there was something else you could do, some little ritual to take the little bad luck off of you. So it was just, it was exhausting sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't actually have a witch in the family. I kind of was the witch in the family, I guess. By the time I was in middle school, a lot of kids had decided I was a witch because I had green eyes, and I didn't have red hair, but there was ginger in my hair by the time I was in high school. Mm-hmm. It had started out blonde, and then it darkened, and it had streaks of like a dark blonde, and then some reddish gingery blonde, and then some light brown and some dark brown. And some of the kids just that's what they thought, because it was hard to pull something over on me. Part of it was just I was really, really alert all the time. I was massively alert. And so it was really hard to sneak up on me or, do anything. But, I did, by the time middle school rolled around, I'd gotten interested in psychic phenomena, and my best friend and I wanted to go to Duke University to the J.B. Rhine Institute and become parapsychologists.
Yeah.
Of course, by the time we graduated high school, they closed it down. But,
yeah, I know. I'd had the same plans at one time. That, and I wanted to go to the National Academy of Broadcasting there in Knoxville and learn to be a DJ. And darn if the very week that I graduated high school, the NAB closed its doors in Knoxville. And I thought, well, I'll go to the University of Tennessee and study communications, broadcasting. And then I saw the course load, all the foreign languages and the electricity and electronics. And I'm like, I don't want to build a radio station. I just want to sit and talk in front of a microphone like I'm doing right now. So I ended up, started out in pre-law, ended up in English, long story. But just it's fascinating. And just growing up in the South, it's like it might as well be a whole other planet, particularly when you get off into some of those smaller areas like I've been in Upper East Tennessee and parts of Virginia and West Virginia. That whole area from, say, Boone, North Carolina up into, say, Abingdon, Virginia, beyond up into West Virginia. There's like just a streak there of strangeness.
Oh yeah, it's weird. I have some roots in Tennessee because one of my aunts, when she married her husband, he was a Lutheran minister. His church was in Nashville, and she moved there. And then her sister came and moved in with her after she had her baby, and it was tragic. She The first aunt had cancer and died, and it was really sad. But the second aunt stayed and went to college. She went to Peabody University, and I went to visit her fairly frequently, and it always killed me. I don't really show much of my West Virginia accent anymore because when I was in college going for a journalism degree, I kind of beat it out of myself. So as to, they call it code switching now when an Appalachian person gets rid of their accent so that they don't get, people don't assume that they're ignorant, backwards Hicks. And so they call it code switching. Yeah, I kind of permanently code switched myself.
Yeah, you don't have much of an accent that I can detect, and I still have some, not like the people where I grew up, but I'll always have some. But I didn't like myself the way I sounded for a long time. I thought I sounded like an educated hillbilly, and that's essentially what I am. So I've come to embrace it. And I get a lot of compliments on my voice here. So if the people are happy with it, then right on. But to me, it never sounds recorded and played back to me. It doesn't sound like it does in my head. And I'm sure that's because the way it reverberates around in my skull and my sinus cavities and all that. But I'll play it back and I'm like, do I really sound like that? So a lot of my stuff, the things that I narrate and stuff, of course, I have to listen to it while I'm editing it. But I don't go back and play it because I don't like the sound of my own voice.
I'm the same way. I am the same way. I don't mind my singing voice, but my speaking voice, and what am I doing? I'm doing a podcast. I mean, what the heck, kind of, I don't even, whatever. It was kind of a crazy thing. But yeah, I used to go visit her, and it always made me crack up to go to Nashville and meet her friends. She had a lady who owned a really nice inn and restaurant, and her name was Phyla. And I think that's just such a Southern name, Phyla.
It is.
It's such a pretty name. And I remember going to meet Phyla at her farm, and she was having a big to-do, a big get-together, and I met all these people. I didn't even know who they were. I was in college. And so I still had a little bit of the West Virginia accent. I was still working on getting rid of it, excising it and turning it into sort of a Midwestern, flat, boring accent. And, but it was still there. I still said things like accent. So it was still a little bit there. And so we're sitting on our porch after the most of the dinner is done, and we were just having some coffee and cake and sitting in rocking chairs on this giant porch. She had this huge old plantation house, and we're just rocking and sitting, and she was so funny. She says to me, "Oh, honey, you have the most charming northern accent I ever heard." And I was just like, oh my God, you think I have a northern accent? And then I would go up north to visit people in New York, and they were like, they were like, wow, you sound so Southern. I'm like, oh, you have no idea. You have no clue. And then it's really funny. Then, I come back to Athens, and after I've sort of de-Southernized my accent, and, I was talking with a farmer at the farmer's market one time. We got to be really good friends, and I said something about being from West Virginia, and being a country girl from West Virginia, and he's like, you are not from West Virginia. He was from Cincinnati, so they, that far south, like right across the river from Kentucky, there's some Kentucky accent creeping into the Ohioans. And he said, you are not. He's like, you don't sound a thing like you're from West Virginia. And I said, hey, I was like, I very carefully got rid of it so that people wouldn't assume that I was ignorant backwoods and whatnot. And he said, well, can you talk in your real accent? And I said, well, one of two things has to happen. I either have to get tired and then it'll come out a little bit, or I have to be drinking. I said, then it'll come out. Or if I'm around a lot of other West Virginians and they have thicker accents, then it will kind of, it'll
it creeps back in. If I go back home, or even I've had people tell me that they can tell when I'm talking to somebody back home because I
Yeah.
kind of lapse back into it and I don't even realize I'm doing it. And
Yeah.
my dad would do the same thing. Middle Tennessee, Cumberland Plateau area, it was different. The plateau, as they call it, it was a different Appalachian accent. But again, you could tell an arrowhead was an arrowhead, and just
Yeah.
little things like that, and you would hear that creep in. But I've spent a lot of time away from Tennessee. I've been overseas a lot and been out on the West Coast now for over 15 years. So hopefully that's helped some. But out here, it does kind of stand out. And then back
Hmm.
home, yeah, they'd be like, you sound like, I even had somebody tell me that one time, said, you sound like a Yankee. And I'm like,
Oh
dude,
yeah.
that was somebody
Oh
in
yeah.
Tennessee. And I'm like, dude, I was born and raised here, lived here 40 years. What are you talking about, Yankee?
Yeah, I've been accused of being a Yankee too. Although, West Virginia, it's a no man's land because, we seceded from Virginia that seceded from the Union. So,
Well, I've even had people tell me
you
that
know.
the proper way to say it is West by God, Virginia, so that
Oh
it's
yeah.
separated from Virginia because they don't
Yes.
like that
Yes. We
association.
Mountaineers did not care for the Tidewater aristocrats at all because we were poor and they weren't.
Hmm.
And so West Virginians are not fond of. Yeah, that's why by God happens. Yeah.
Well, Barbara, I think we've taken up 2 hours of your time here. I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping
All
it up.
right.
But this has been fascinating, and thank you for spending so much time with us. This is about double the amount we usually run. And you told me that you were able to talk, and I appreciate it.
I'm a
I
talker.
love the stories. I get that way too, and get somebody on here that'll talk with me if I don't keep an eye on it. I know Cisco Murdoch and I went 3 hours one time and didn't even
Oh my
realize
goodness.
it. But she and I have talked on the telephone before for over 6 hours. So
Oh wow.
she's a storyteller too, just fascinating lady.
It's
But
an Appalachian thing.
it is. She's from Alabama by way of New Jersey. She spent time in both places. She grew up in Alabama, but spent time with her grandparents and back and forth. So she's kind of a mix. But
Right.
it's the Alabama side of her, I think, that the storyteller there. But thank you so much. I've been putting the link to your website in there, the 6 Degrees of John Keel, and the podcasts are on there too. What's next for you? You got more episodes coming up? I
Oh
think
yeah.
that somebody in the chat said a new one had just come out.
Yes, a new one just came out. That one was when we invited Tim Renner, and he very, very kindly came on. He was our first author. My poor daughter Morgana. I mean, she's 30, so she's not like she's a little girl or anything, but she was starstruck and it was kind of a little bit. It was funny because she eventually chilled out and we all chilled out with each other and we had a great time. And so that one just came out and we're recording one tomorrow called Darkest Night, Brightest Light,
Mhm.
and it's going to be about the paranormal side of Christmas
Oh,
and
that'll be
the
awesome.
winter holidays. And after that, that's all we're going to have for December, unless we do something surprising and amazing for New Year's, which we might. And then in January, we're going to go to once a week broadcasts because we've gotten enough episodes banked that we've already recorded that just need to be edited and put together that we can go weekly and not be running around like chickens with our heads cut off
Yeah,
going, oh my God, I don't
exactly.
know. Yeah.
Uh-huh. I've just started doing a podcast. Jim and Jade and I are doing one called Strange Things. And our third episode just came out tonight. Go check it out, folks. I'll put a link in the description. Talking strange Ouija board stories this time. But I probably put 40 hours a week in on a podcast episode with all the editing and recording and
Yeah.
this, that, and the other. And we finally got smart, and we've got 2 or 3 more now that we've recorded in our spare time in the can. So I'm still not really comfortable to the point where I'm going to use those. So we're still doing the current episode, but I do have 2 back there. But it involves a lot. But
Oh,
if
it
you like to
does.
talk and you like to tell stories, it goes fast, and it's not really like work. I've worked a
Yeah.
lot harder jobs, in my life.
Oh, yeah.
I'd much rather do this if I can sit and talk or sit and write a book for people to read. And that's how I got into this. I kind of got into it backwards. I'd written books, And then I started watching YouTube, and I thought, hey, this looks like fun. And I was listening to some of the horror narrators, and I thought, well, I could do that, but where would I get the stories? And I thought, well, I've got 2 books full of stories here,
I
and
was
then
about to
some, 3
say, and
books.
then the light came on, and you went,
Yeah,
wait, I've written
and
them.
started 13 past midnight, narrated my own stories, and that just one thing led to another. And then I ended up here. Bill had heard me and brought me on as a full partner on this channel, and then this started blowing up, and now we've got almost 60,000 subscribers here, and I love it. This is what I was meant to do. I'm happy, either writing
See,
or showing up somewhere to talk about writing or just talking.
yeah, you finally got to do the radio thing. You didn't
Yeah,
have to go to school for it.
and then KPNL, the radio station that Ann Celine that was in the chat here, she's given me. I help her do some voiceover stuff. I do some behind the scenes there. I edit her episodes of her podcast, Caravan Library of Lore, and she's given me some airtime on the radio. In fact, tonight at midnight, I have a show called Dead of Night. It's midnight Pacific, so that's 3 a.m. for you East Coast people. And it's just me and the microphone. I get on there and talk. Now, I have had a guest on there, but it's just me talking. And then Saturday nights, I have a music show where I play a lot of strange music. You just have to turn in to listen to it, and that's called Ritual Radio. So I'm all over the place. I know
That's
it's been
awesome.
been a crap year for a lot of people, but typical Steve Stockton fashion, I'm having the best year ever.
That's great, and you're giving people something to look forward to and listen to in this time. You know, that's part of why we finally did do the podcast.
Yeah, and
Is
it's great.
that
I've listened to several
yeah,
episodes. I haven't heard all of them yet, but I like to put a podcast on when I'm laying down. I'm an insomniac. I only sleep about 2 or 3 hours at a time. But
I
I
understand that.
love to, if I'm just relaxing, I can lay there and listen to a podcast. And you guys have been on my current rotation. So
Well, thank you.
hopefully by the time I get them listened, all of them with the new one included, there'll be some more coming out. But looking
There will
forward
be.
to it. And again, Barbara, thank you so much for coming on with us tonight. Um,
Thank you for having me.
Sure, it's our pleasure. We'd like to have you back sometime. I'm
Okay,
going to go ahead and wrap up here. If you would, stay on the line with me, and I'll talk to you just a
I
little
will.
bit after I tell everybody goodbye here. Again, folks, thanks for showing up tonight. It's been fun as always. Uh, my favorite way to spend a Friday, sometimes Saturday. Jeannie Lindquist, I've seen you in there. I just didn't get a chance to say hi to you, but thank you for showing up. And everybody, all my mods, got the best mods in the business here. Melissa from Deprogrammed Podcast, go check her out, folks. She's got some amazing stuff. If you like to delve into cults and cult leaders and things like that, brilliant stuff. Jose, good to see you. Petite Aubergine, that's my daughter Jessica. Thank you for showing up. Thanks to everybody. And yeah, the podcast that just dropped, the strange Ouija board stories. Let me go ahead and put a link in here for that for you. And it's on all the favorite podcatchers and things. It's on Apple Podcasts and Google and everywhere. But a lot of people like to listen to it on YouTube. So here's the YouTube link for it in the chat for the latest episode. Like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel there. That's Gemma Jade and I. And yeah, she's a lot of fun to work with. She's very talented. She has a channel, just Gemma Jade. She does true crime, among other things. Check her out and show her some love. She's just really getting started. She's only got 306 subscribers. Let's see if we can't get her to 400 or beyond. I'll put a link to her chat or her channel in here too. And then said join me tonight on KPNL Radio. We have Dave Scott, Spaced Out Radio. He starts at 9 o'clock to midnight. And then following his show at midnight, we'll go right into the dead of night. And then tomorrow night, Ritual Radio at, what time did I run that? 9 o'clock. It starts at 9 o'clock Pacific and goes to midnight. So again, everyone, thank you for showing up. Whatever it is, wherever you are, have a good evening, a good night, a good morning. I love each and every one of you. TC, good to see you here. Another one of my favorite mods. And Gigi, lots of great people here. All right, folks, that's going to be it for me. I'm Steve Stockton, and I'll talk to you next time. Good night, everybody. Hey, are you folks still here? I've just been putting stuff up for my other shows and things, and I didn't end the stream, so I thought I'd just pop back in and give you a little extra here. Not sure what's going on with that mic, but it sounds like I'm only coming through one channel. Let me click around here. Actually, I'd been talking for the last 10 minutes because when I hung up with Barbara, it hung up my Skype as well, and I didn't realize that then when my mic's, even though it shows as active, it wasn't active. There, now I hear myself in stereo. I decided just to pop back in. I was promoting some of my own stuff there, but yeah, that's my show at midnight tonight on KPNL. That's after Spaced Out Radio with Dave Scott, my little freeform talk show, the dead of night. I like the idea of that. Just so that's when I wanted to be a DJ. When I thought that's what I wanted to do, that's the shift that I wanted. I wanted the late shift, the 11 to 7 or so. The guy that sat in there in the dead of night and played records for the insomniacs and third shift workers, the graveyard shift, and all that. But join me, KPNL Radio, or join me, KPNL Radio. It's kpnl-db.com, or they have an app for Android and Apple phones. If you go into the Play Store, the Apple App Store there, and search for KPNL, they have an app in there. And then tomorrow night at 9 o'clock Pacific, it's my other little freeform music show there that I'm doing, Ritual Radio. Now, don't talk much, if any, at all on that one. Excuse me. That's just something a little darker. It's not for everybody, obviously. Witch house, dark wave, vaporwave, goth, industrial. If you're not aware of any of these kinds of music, any of these genres, come check it out. You might find that you enjoy it. I'm all over the place. I listen to a little bit of everything from opera to country to punk to rock and roll to world music. And this is just some of the genres that I picked out to do something a little different to kind of fit in with the whole doom and gloom and it being bleak and wintertime. But come over and check that out sometime. It's so far I'm going to be doing it every Saturday night from 9 to midnight Pacific on kpnl-db.com. And a lot of stuff going on over there. It's a paranormal talk radio. We replay a lot of podcasts, and there's audio from some of my videos on there. My podcast plays on there. And then we have some live shows. We have the Experiencer Assistance Network. I'm getting the name of it wrong. It's the guys from Not Another Tinfoil Hat, and they do a special show for experiencers and helping people out that have had strange experiences. They're on Thursday nights from 7 to 8. And then we have Dave Scott, Spaced Out Radio. He's live simulcasting Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to midnight Pacific. He's out of Canada. Dave's a great guy, has some amazing guests, and just night after night after night. Can't imagine doing a 3-hour show 5 nights a week. He has a booker and things like that. So whoever does his bookings, Corinth is the guy's name. He does a great job. But come on, listen to Dave, listen to me later. I'll be on there later tonight and tomorrow night. And I do a lot of behind the scenes work, voiceover work, engineering work for KPNL. Lady Ann Celine that was in the chat here earlier. She's my boss over there. But all right, folks, I'm going to let you go for real now. I just kind of decided to hang around and chat with y'all. But check out the podcast, the new version, the new episode that just dropped. Strange Ouija board stories. The previous episodes we had Strange New Jersey and Strange Urban Legends that we believed as kids. That's the link I just put in there as to the podcast. But go check that out. Like, share, subscribe. We just started that 3 weeks ago. We've got 44 subscribers. We'd love to have some more people come in. And Gemma Jade, my co-host and podcast partner, she's got her own channel. She covers true crime, among other things. She's only got about 300 subscribers. If you would go show her some love, I would appreciate that too. Let's see if we can't get her. There's Gemma Jade's channel. Let's see if we can't get her to 400. Website, I will put it in a link for you here. Give me just a moment to pull it up so I don't fat finger it. And also, the KPNL, there is an app for that for Android and for Apple phones. But we have a lot of fun on KPNL. Obviously, if they put up with me, they've got a good sense of humor. Uh-oh. Started KPNL up, and of course, it's live, so it's playing something. So let me that down. Sorry if I blasted you over there. KPNL, there's the link. Website. But yeah, the podcast, Strange Things, Gemma Jade's channel, and KPNL. So I'll be on there later tonight after Dave Scott. All right, folks, I'm really going to let you go this time. But thanks again. Oh, yeah, Bomber shouting out Corrence, the booking guy there. He does an amazing, amazing job. And a lot of people here I see in the chat on Dave's show. I see Chris there and Bomber. Jose's there. Jose is like our number one fan for KPNL. He's a big part of everything that we do. He always shows up and very supportive. He's our number one fan. Like to have a whole listening audience of thousands of Jose. But anyway, y'all come on over. You're more than welcome. And I will see you next Friday night here. We got some, of course, new videos coming out this week. Got another listener stories coming up. What else have I turned in this week? We've got another Land of the Lost episode coming up. Got a lot of good things coming up. And then next Friday night, I'll be doing another live stream. I don't exactly know who my guest is going to be, but depending on which one it is, they're both fabulous, and you'll love both of them. So one, if it doesn't work out, I won't know their schedule till tomorrow, then I've got a standby. But then the other one will go on. And then Christmas night, I'm going to have a trio of guests on Christmas night, so that'll be one to look forward to. And then New Year's Eve, I'm going to go early that night. Just because it is New Year's Eve, I'll probably go about 2 or 3 p.m. Pacific, so you can listen early and then still get your New Year's party on, no matter which coast you live on or even in the UK. But lots of good things coming up. Again, thank you for showing up and doing what I do, or showing up and enjoying what I do, I meant to say. And I love each and every one of you. This is what I'm happy doing here. And what you hear me do now, where I just sit and babble into a microphone, this is what you can kind of expect on the dead of night. Just free form, me and a microphone, nothing playing. Now, I have had a guest on, Lady Ann from Caravan Library Lore was on with me last week, but first episode, it was just me talking like this and babble till I think of something to say. My father used to accuse me of that. But if you enjoy talking to me, if you want to come, and we have a Discord for KPNL. If you go to the website there's a Discord server. Come into the Discord, and then you can listen to me. I look at the Discord and interact with the chat on there. So hope to see some of you at midnight. Otherwise, I'll see you here throughout the week or for the next live show. All right, folks, I'm really, really gone this time. I know I've been shutting up for the last 15 minutes. But thanks again to everyone who turned out. Thanks to Bill Melder for bringing me on as a full partner and providing me a platform to do what I do for all you guys. Thanks again. I love each and every one of you. Till next time, Steve Stockton here. Thanks again.